when the UAW went to the Works Council, she basically said, yeah, we're going to come out, we're going to tell management, not only do we support the union, but we're going to say to management, no captive audience speeches, no union busting law firm, or you're going to have trouble with us.
Stephen J. Silvia is a professor at American University's School of International Service and an affiliate professor in American University's Economics Department. He teaches international economics, international trade relations, and comparative politics. He is also the author of the UAW's Southern Gamble, and he is our next guest. Professor, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacob. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Yeah, go ahead.
No, fine. Keep going.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I've been really looking forward to this conversation since I read your book. I actually got it as a gift from my national organizing director in AFGE. I happened to visit with him while I was in D.C. for work a couple of months ago, and I read it very quickly. It was a very good book, and I mean, very comprehensive. There's a lot of detail in the book that I even wonder if some of it is like breaking as in never been seen before. If you know of anything that was in the book that had never been published before, I would be interested if you were like breaking news with that book. But it was published last year, and I would recommend folks reading it. Folks read it. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Sure, great to be here. There are a few things that I think had never been seen before. One thing that I would say would be there was this whole period in the 1980s where the UAW, after they had the initial losses in trying to organize at Nissan and Honda in Marysville, Ohio, they didn't even try. They almost did an election, but then they pulled back in the last minute. And the UAW then went to several PR firms, and they spoke to the PR firms, and the PR firms gave them advice on how to organize Southern workers, workers in Japanese plants. And they first went to one, and in this company, it looked more like they just wanted to make a lot of money because they had this huge bill for this massive PR campaign they wanted to do. And then they went to a second PR firm that had done a lot of stuff with labor already. But even that one, in the end, the whole story closes out with the president of the UAW at the time, Owen Bieber. He had a sticky note on the report, and his aide, Dick Shoemaker, also had a sticky note on the report. And so Dick Shoemaker basically says on his sticky note, "We don't need these people. We know what to do." And then Owen Bieber's sticky note said, "Agreed, file." So, whether or not drawing on a PR firm would have made a difference, I'm doubtful about that. But at the same time, I think, the evidence of history shows they didn't know what to do either. And it's only in this year that we've had a transplant in the South organized.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I thought that was a fun story to see, and I did enjoy reading. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of kind of the PR companies. I'm sure there are some that do good work, and there's some that could be genuinely helpful and have good kind of political instinct for like what we're trying to do. But my instinct is that a lot of PR firms are more, they're not really interested in the supporting organizing. They're, like you said, they're interested in making money for themselves, or not organizing stuff. And so I have a similar instinct.
They're going to bring a campaign that they use to sell toothpaste or or soap or something, and that isn't going to work.
Right. Yeah. It's because unionism is not, in my view, a product to be sold. We're not selling insurance. We are trying to convince workers to recognize their power and make use of it and to organize together. We're not like, it's not a product. And I think that,
Absolutely.
the kind of history of the labor movement has shown that in eras where we don't treat it like a product we're trying to sell, we treat it like, we are organizing together, recognizing our power and leveraging it and doing, that for ourselves and for our communities. Seems like that's kind of the thing that has been, more successful than the kind of like trying to make unions like super, palatable or whatever, or selling it like a product, like you said. So I guess, a good thing a good place to start would be a broad overview of the UAW's history, to kind of set the stage for your book, which really dives in on the last 35 years or so. A broad overview of the UAW's history, its rise kind of contrasted with its subsequent stagnation and decline. Can you just give us that broad outline?
Sure. So the UAW was founded in 1935. It was founded as an industrial union for auto workers. And it was right at that point when there was the big split in the American Federation of Labor. And the UAW was initially constituted as an AFL union, but John L. Lewis took several unions out to form what was the Committee of Industrial Organizations, and then become the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And that happened a year later in 1936. And the UAW was one of the unions that came out, with the mine workers, Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers, the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, the International Typographical Workers Union. So they all set up a rival union confederation. And then in that year, 1936, the UAW really began a militant campaign, and they had a lesser-known sit-down strike at a GM plant in Atlanta that happened in 1936. And that was the first GM plant that was organized by the UAW. And then at the very end of 1936 and into 1937, they had the much more famous Flint sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan. And that ultimately led to General Motors getting organized. And then a year later, they organized Chrysler. And it took a while with Ford, because Henry Ford was very anti-union. But when the buildup for World War II started, it became pretty clear at the time, with Franklin Roosevelt as president, that Ford wasn't going to get any military contracts unless it recognized the UAW. So in 1941, Ford recognized the UAW. So at that point, the UAW, there were other companies as well, like American Motors and a few others that don't exist now. But by that point, by World War II, the UAW had organized all of the car plants in the United States. And another thing to note in that early period is that the internal politics of the UAW were pretty rough and tumble, that you had different factions within the UAW that duked it out for about 10 years. The first president of the UAW was Homer Martin, who was sort of really, he was more of a fundamentalist and didn't really have an ideological position beyond that. And in 1938, the left wing of the UAW managed to dominate and get the person who they wanted in, a guy named R.J. Thomas. And he wasn't a communist, but most of his support was from the Communist Party of the U.S. And there was a fight then between R.J. Thomas and a social democratic wing of the UAW, which was headed by Walter Reuther and his brothers. And in the end, Walter Reuther manages to become president of the UAW in 1946. And this period shaped a lot of the internal politics of the UAW because it was so brutal as a battle. Once the Ruther faction managed to get a hold of the presidency, they set up a lot of structures that locked things in so that it was very difficult to remove them. In fact, Sean Fain is the first president who is not from the Ruther faction, since that 1946 victory by Walter Reuther and his brothers taking over the UAW. So it meant that internal democracy within the UAW was not its strong suit, to put it kindly. But that said, the UAW has always been a progressive voice within the U.S. labor movement. That during the 1950s, the UAW backed the civil rights campaigns and continued to do so into the 1960s. The biggest single financial contributor to Martin Luther King's March on Washington was the UAW. In fact, if you look at the pictures of the signs from those marches, or from that big march, you can see they're basically UAW signs that have it with the UAW print style and everything. So the UAW was very important in that. The UAW was highly critical eventually of the Vietnam War. And you had a lot of tension within the labor movement at that point. You had a more conservative faction around the president of the AFL-CIO, George Meany, and Walter Reuther, who was more progressive. Now, Walter Reuther died in a plane crash in 1970. He was flying to northern Michigan, and the plane crashed. And so this led to a sudden crisis within the union in pulling itself together. But successors of Walter Reuther from the Reuther Caucus, as it's been called, it's had two names, Administrative Caucus and Reuther Caucus, that they then became the successive presidents of the UAW until we get to Sean Fain. But it was really at this early 70s point where the UAW reached its pinnacle and began to decline. I should say a couple things also on just what they did in collective bargaining. They were very innovative in a number of areas, that they got supplemental unemployment benefits. That meant that if you were unemployed, and that would happen particularly in autos, there'd be layoffs for plant changeover and things, that not only did you get government unemployment benefits, but the companies paid into a fund to supplement the unemployment benefits that you got, and a number of other things in terms of paid holidays. And they also got protections for layoffs, that you would remain employed. So there are a number of the big benefits that happened. Cost of living adjustment was a UAW innovation. So an extra clause in your contract that not only would you get what was negotiated, but you would get also whatever the inflation rate was, that would automatically be added. And that was something that was taken away in the late 70s, early 80s, and Sean Fain ultimately got it back last year. So there's a good 20 years where that was missing. But the 1970s proved to be difficult for the UAW. First, you had the oil shocks, the oil embargoes that happened in the 1970s. There were two big ones, one 73, 74, and then 78, 79. And that led to the price of gas going up, which was really difficult for the auto industry because sales fell, and it led to a lot of layoffs. The other thing that you had is you began to get foreign auto plants, first foreign auto imports in the 60s, and then in the 70s they really accelerated, which again caused layoffs and displacement in the industry for the unionized sector. And then you had transplants, foreign-owned auto plants start to arrive. The first one was actually Volkswagen in Pennsylvania, which they ultimately closed down in the 80s. And then the Japanese plants started coming in the late 70s and early 80s. And you have a period of retrenchment and decline in membership, in share of automobile output in the US that's made by unionized workers. And then you get to the real low point, I would say, was the corruption scandals that happened in the second half of the 2010s, where there was high-level figures, including two UAW presidents, were convicted of corruption, taking money from the companies, Chrysler in particular, and also taking money from the UAW itself. And that was the low point for the union. And then after that, there was sort of a cleanup period for a bit, where you had a couple of presidents, and then there was a settlement with the United States Department of Justice that led to Shawn Fain ultimately being elected president of the UAW. That there was first a referendum. Would you move, would the UAW adopt a one union member, one vote system to pick the president of the union and move away from the traditional union convention picking the president? And the members voted for a one member, one vote direct election of the president and the International Executive Board. And then there were the elections that took place in 22, and then there was it had to be a second round of elections because nobody got a majority in 23, spring of 23. And that's when Shawn Fain won by a little over 600 votes against his opponent, Ray Curry. And and then once that happened, Shawn Fain then was in place to do the strategy to have the stand-up strike of 2023. And there's obvious the play on the name stand-up strike from the very beginnings of the UAW, where it was the sit-down strikes that led to the UAW really getting its first footing in the auto industry, and the successes there, and then that rolling into the organizing drives that we've seen at the transplant companies over the past year. So that's a sort of brief Cliff Notes history of the UAW.
I think that was a really great, that tracks with most of the high points, the important things that you would put on a timeline. I think that was a really great, kind of 5-10 minute history for the UAW. And it's interesting that Fain, like you mentioned, is the first president since Ruther not to come out of the Ruther caucus, or the administration caucus as it was later called, but he clearly and explicitly wants to be a Ruther-like figure. I mean, he talks about Ruther being, kind of one of the people that he styles himself after, that he would like to be a modern day equivalent of a Walter Reuther, hopefully in the good ways. There were a lot, Reuther is not an unambiguously good figure. Like you said, he put up some very, very strong protections for his caucus against intervention from any other wings of the UAW, anybody with differing opinions, and made it ultimately into a very kind of top-down union, and purged a lot of the left-wing elements from the UAW. Some would argue, not coincidentally, right before the decline. Some would say it wasn't a factor, but I'll leave people to judge that for themselves. So hopefully, he takes from the good and not the bad.
Right.
But the you mentioned the warehouse Volkswagen West Morehouse Volkswagen plant in Pennsylvania, and folks can read more about that in your book. But it's interesting that in subsequent campaigns that the UAW had, people pointed to that as a reason to be skeptical of the UAW, because they were blaming the closing of the facility on the UAW. But you point out that at the time that nobody was making that argument, not even management was making that argument. Everybody understood it was management's fault. They were not making the right kind of business decisions, and so they were not able to make the plant profitable, and so they closed it. And just one other comment on kind of that history. You mentioned briefly Homer Martin. He was an interesting figure. You don't talk about him too much in your book. I'd recommend folks read a couple of other books about the UAW. The Many and the Few is a good book about the sit-down strikes of 1937. There's some about Homer Martin in there. And there was another book that I read about the UAW. I can't remember what it was, but he was an interesting fellow. He was a preacher, and reportedly a great orator, but ultimately totally inept as an executive and administrative figure in the union, and finally was, like you said, voted out. But then after he was voted out, he founded a competitor to the UAW with the AFL after the CIO split, in close coordination with raging anti-Semite Father Coughlin, who previous to that was more kind of ambiguous and had some pro-labor kind of stuff, but ultimately delved completely into fascism and was not a great look for the AFL, but folks should read more about that too. Homer Martin, interesting guy. So with those with those comments about that, I just wanted to put that out there for folks.
Sure.
I wanted
book American Vanguard is a pretty good book about the UAW that really covers its history. So that's another one. And then there's the Brothers Ruther. There's The Most Dangerous Man in Detroit, which is a story about Ruther. So there are some very good books about the UAW.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Brothers Ruther, some people may not realize this. There was three of them. There were three Ruthers, and there was an account. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but of Walter or one of the Ruthers being in like negotiations with the company, and immediately outside, a second Ruther was manning a big like amplification van, like he had a big bullhorn, and he was he was like standing on top of a car, like shouting at a rally. And then somebody comes in and says the third Ruther was leading a strike at some other facility, and the management was like, "By God, how many are you? How many there are you?" It was a pretty funny story. So zooming into the second half of the UAW's history, the stagnation and the decline and the kind of fall of the UAW, a big focus of the UAW over those years was the organization of these foreign automotive manufacturers. Some people, you push back very heavily against the idea that the UAW just sat back and let it happen. That they invested tens of millions of dollars in organizing the South, which I did not know before I read your book. And I'm very appreciative to know that, because it's important to know that they didn't just sit kind of idly by. You can disagree maybe with the strategies and the tactics, but there was real effort put in to organizing the South by the UAW, basically over the course of this entire era. And so one question that of course you and I know, but maybe some folks listening might not know, is just why is it important that the UAW organize the foreign automotive manufacturers? Why have they spent so much resources going after this goal, and why should they?
Yeah, it's really helpful for all unions if you can take wages and benefits off the table, is something that companies compete against one another with. And when the Southern plants came in, certainly the big three, they would say, well,
Mm.
there are lower wages at Nissan, there are lower wages at Honda, so we can't pay what you're asking for because we got to compete with those plants. So taking those wages off, out of competition, making, the UAW contract the standard at every single plant gives you the opportunity to have a better contract. So that's why the focus is there.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right, and very succinct. And it's not like it's a a business thing because they want the dues money. The dues money is not the important thing for a union to organize these non-union automotive manufacturers. It's to gain leverage in contract negotiations with current organized workplaces, but also, to help because there's a genuine, kind of inclination and logic to organizing other workers. If you are an organized worker, if you're an organized union member, there's a real drive to try to bring everybody in because there's a, there's a real logic to that. It's not about, the dues money. There's a lot more to it there. And unfortunately, there are a lot of union members that push back against new organizing because they see, if you think kind of in the individualistic mindset that a lot of, American media kind of just pounds into you, you see your dues money going to help somebody else, right? Help somebody else organize. And so they do this when they invest in organizing, when unions invest in organizing. Sometimes they do it over the protestations of many of their own members. And so it's, not like super clearly.
That's short-sighted. You have to think that
Right.
businesses are always going to try to figure out a way to get around you if you have a union contract. And the way that this happened in the automobile industry is this investment in the South. One thing that's worth noting is even before the transplants, General Motors in the 1970s, they did something that was called the Southern Strategy. And so the General Motors executives, they decided they were going to build a whole set of parallel plants in the South, and they did. And the UAW fought hard and organized them and eventually did organize them. And so this is a common strategy. Boeing did this, that, Boeing used to produce in the Northwest, and then they, set up a whole parallel facility in the South, and it's non-union. And that way they can play off, the machinists who've organized Boeing, they can play them off and they can say, well, we can produce 20% cheaper at our other plants. So we're not gonna give you the raise that you're asking for. So for unions, union members, you always have to be vigilant about that sort of thing. That your boss is always trying to think of a way to lower costs, and you're one of those costs.
Right.
So the way to avoid the boss being able to do that is have everybody organized.
Exactly. So, talk to us about, you mentioned, and like I said, you are very, very forceful in pushing back against the idea that the UAW just, they didn't do anything. They didn't care. There was no investment. Nothing happened. You push back against that idea very hard. And I think, correctly. So can you highlight a couple of those campaigns that stick out in your mind as informative in understanding the different strategies that the UAW had in organizing these Southern foreign automotive manufacturers, and some of the differences in tactics and the different results? Notably, they were successful in organizing a lot of the Daimler facilities where they were not at basically anybody else until Volkswagen, like you said, last year. Highlight some of the important campaigns and tactics that you feel like folks ought to know.
Sure. Bringing up the Daimler truck example, what's called Daimler Truck today, is an excellent one. That the German company Daimler, they in the 1980s they bought Freightliner, the Freightliner truck company. And Freightliner was doing precisely one of these parallel plant strategies that Freightliner traditionally produced in Portland, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest. But in the 1980s, they started building plants in North Carolina. And Daimler buys up Freightliner, and then shortly thereafter, there's an organizing drive in North Carolina. So the organizing drive unfolds, and one of the things that the UAW did is they went to Germany, and they went and they spoke to the German Metalworkers Union, and then they went and they spoke to the Works Council. Now, German industrial relations is a complex system, but it does matter here when your company is German. You've got two bodies that represent workers in Germany. One is unions, but the other one is a works council. And whereas our unions do the things that both unions and works councils do in Germany, they've got a division of labor between works councils and unions. So works councils are elected bodies. Workers in a plant, they have an election, and they vote for a set of representatives. And they've got protection in the law. They are not unions, though. They are these elected bodies. And then you have unions, and you may say, well, what do unions do? Well, unions have in Germany, they have the exclusive right to do collective bargaining. Works councils cannot sign contracts that are collective bargaining agreements. Only unions can. And in Germany, collective bargaining typically takes place at the level above a company. So this is something that people have talked about in the US, about having sectoral level bargaining. In essence, you do have that in Germany. But the works councils and the unions, they can sometimes be a bit frenemies as well, that they're both trying to represent the workers and they don't want to poach, the other, each doesn't want the other to dominate it. So there can be a bit of tension between works councils and unions as well. So that's sort of the general German system. And what the UAW did is they spoke to the union, and then they went to Stuttgart in Germany, where Daimler has their headquarters, and they spoke to the head of the Works Council. And the head of the Works Council at the time, he was very forceful in dealing with Daimler management. And he said, if you make trouble for the workers in North Carolina, you're going to have trouble with us in Germany. And they can make trouble, the works councils, even though they don't have the right to strike. They can do a lot of things, work to rule, and a number of things that can make life difficult for management. And so that led when, I'm going to bring us back to North Carolina. The UAW is trying to bargain with Freightliner. They've been trying over a year. Company is just dragging its feet. And eventually, the union had to go out on strike to get a contract. And one of the things that enabled them to win that strike was that the company did not hire permanent replacements. So part of it definitely was the pressure from the German workers' representatives, from the Works Council in particular, that led Daimler not to hire permanent replacements, and eventually they won the strike and they got a contract. So this is another element you can see where international solidarity, it's really hard to do, and a lot of my book shows how often it doesn't work, but it can work, and when it does work, it can be very powerful. Now, the other piece of another case that I'd bring up that would be a Shawn Fain, even a pre-Bob King effort to organize when Bob King was president of the UAW, was the initial efforts to organize at Nissan. Nissan set up a plant in Smyrna, Tennessee, And they hired a former Ford executive, guy by the name of Marvin Runyon. He originally is from Texas. He really didn't like unions at all. And when he came in and became the CEO for Nissan North America, he really developed a strategy to try to make it very, very hard for unions to organize. And it's something that I call in the book, the union avoidance playbook. And it's something that's used certainly outside of the auto sector. And all of the plays Marvin Runyon did not develop, but he really added to the playbook and codified it in a way that made it very effective. And, so among the plays that are in this playbook is locating a plant in rural areas. And if you put a plant in a rural area, it means there are fewer people with experience with unions or family members with experience with unions. And it's really hard to bring people together if they're commuting to this plant from a 100-mile radius. So that's one. Screening out hires who might be sympathetic to joining a union through questionnaires with questions that look innocent but really aren't. Like, have you played sports in high school? And questions like, are you firstborn? And who knew that firstborns tend to be less sympathetic to joining unions than people like me, who was third in a family of six. So interesting, interesting little fact. The other thing is Runyon was among the people who really used the breakdown of using temp workers for a big share of the workforce in order to minimize unionization. Fourth thing that Runyon did was bringing in TV monitors to broadcast company propaganda in the break rooms, in the changing rooms, everywhere. Another thing that Marvin Runyon did is donate lavishly to not just politicians, but to churches and charities, so that if somebody wanted to do an organizing drive and they go to the local church and they say, "Can we use your hall?" that the pastor would think, "Well, boy, Nissan paid for my replacing my roof last year. Do I really want to host a union meeting?" And so these sorts of tactics were very effective in laying a groundwork for making it hard to organize a union. And this is even beyond what happens if a drive starts. And if a drive starts, the first thing that happens is hiring a union avoidance firm, and and then launching the whole process of captive audience meetings and one-on-one meetings, and that whole thing, which I'm sure many of your listeners have experienced. And so this is something that in the Nissan campaign developed. And once you start having the union avoidance law firms, the union busting law firms, is they start they move from one company to another, and they spread all these tactics within the auto industry and outside of the auto industry. So now this is standard practice throughout, not just the South, but throughout the country whenever an organizing drive happens.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. Yeah, and that's you mentioned about the Works Council in Germany and how that was elected, and something that I like to point out when I think that we should have maybe some similar dynamic because this Works Council law, that these elections take place in Germany once a company has reached like X amount of employees. And I think that we should have something like that in the United States, where, collective bargaining is basically mandated. You can, the people can affiliate with the union or not. And we've actually done that before. In World War II, the National War Labor Board did something similar, and companies that wanted to do like defense, they had to engage in collective bargaining. And there was actually I was reading one book, and there's this picture of this CEO literally being carried out of his plant by like the National Guard because the government nationalized his company because he refused to bargain with the elected representatives through the mechanisms of the National War Labor Board. That was, really cool picture, I thought. But yeah, and then you mentioned the company propaganda at Nissan. They call it, I don't know if they still have it, but they called it in your book, the Nissan News Network, which is just wild. And you said that you see this kind of stuff all the time, even today. And we had, there's been some organizing activity at the Hyundai plant in Montgomery, and there was a big preacher locally that has been publicly antagonistic to the union, been writing op-eds in right-wing and non-right-wing outlets across the state about how folks shouldn't organize with the UAW. And believe it or not, Hyundai has donated to him and his church and sponsored like mission trips for them and all that kind of stuff. And at Mercedes in Tuscaloosa, there was a preacher running around literally on the shop floor. Mercedes allowed a preacher, not an employee, who was also a city councilor, to run around and talk to individual employees, pull them off the line, and try to convince them not to unionize. I mean, really blatant kind of stuff. And so with the development of this anti-union playbook, and a lot of it comes from Marvin Runyon and kind of his group, what did the UAW do? What were some of the tactics that they employed to try to fight back against that?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to mention before answering that question, and that is with the notion of works councils. I think they've been very effective in Germany in giving the workers like two places at the table. And not only do they have a works council, but they have on big companies half the seats on the company board as part of this system the Germans call co-determination. However, one has to be very careful because there are senators like Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance who are saying, we want works councils for the United States, but they're not really talking about the German system with works councils in the plants and the unions well established through sectoral level collective bargaining. They're really talking about something that would be a company union. So, for people out there, you got to have a bit of buyer beware. If you've got some selling of works councils for the U.S., sometimes it's just they want to change the law to make it possible to have company unions again. So you really have to look under the hood and see what's there before you buy onto it. Now, to your question in how to get around the playbook, a lot of, there were different things that were tried at different times. And, Bob King, who eventually became president of the UAW, he was pretty innovative and he really did a lot of experimentation. The UAW was one of the first unions to use cell phones when cell phones were new to coordinate their organizing drive. They were also one of the first unions to use computers to try to coordinate their drives. So you had, trying to use the newest technologies. The other things when Bob King was president that he tried, there were two things that I think stand out. One, he really tried to cut a deal with German management to try to play on German management. German management had signed all these international agreements recognizing the right to bargain, the right to have unions, and really tried to get them to follow the more cooperative system. They call it social partnership in Germany, and to bring that to the US. And in the end, it didn't, just sort of trying to do things over the top and trying to make arguments which are sound arguments that union rights are civil rights are human rights, and to try to basically shame German management into respecting workers' rights like they do in Germany. That's what he tried, and it's a complex story. In 2014, Volkswagen management was sort of willing to come along with that. The Mercedes management was less, really did oppose all that, but eventually that didn't work. The other thing that Bob King did for a Nissan plant, their third major plant, which was in Canton, Mississippi, their second assembly plant, that he sort of spearheaded a civil rights campaign to try to stress, workers' rights or civil rights, and to organize with the civil rights leadership in Mississippi to organize that plant. Again, it was a top-down approach, and ultimately it didn't work. But as part of it, they brought in Bernie Sanders, they brought in the rapper Common, they brought in Danny Glover, and tried that sort of more public relations style campaign. But, as I said, in the end, it didn't work.
Right. And there was, there were several other things that they have done over the years to try to mix it up. Like you mentioned, they tried at Nissan in Canton, Mississippi to really lean into the civil rights stuff. Whereas in other places, they kind of tried to be, or they didn't really engage with the community as much. There were different approaches with relationships to management, trying to, work out some sort of election deal versus just, trying to run surprise elections. And ultimately, in every case besides Daimler and besides this different Volkswagen election, or the Volkswagen election just last year, they, like you said, the different tactics were all ultimately unsuccessful. And, one of the thing that I'm interested in your thoughts on, as far as those tactics, is that when reading your book, something that I observed is that I didn't see much about what was actually happening like inside of the plant, right? When I read The Many and the Few about the 1937 sit-down strikes, all so much of the book and the testimony is about like, okay, so and so from this department was talking to so and so in this department, and they were setting up, they were going to do this work stoppage in this way, and they had this plan, and it was all like there was so much about what was going on, like actually internal to the plant, and it seemed to me that a lot of what the focus was on these campaigns was what the UAW was doing outside of the plant, right? Like, are they engaging with civic leaders or not? Are they engaging with international labor or not? Are they trying to, be nice to management or not? Are they putting forward this, persona of like a new, more cooperative UAW or not, right? I didn't feel like I got a super great sense of what was going on inside the plant. Like, how did they create the committee? How did they structure organizing conversations? How did they talk to other workers? Did they map the workplace, right? And so was that a limitation of the UAW's archives? Like, you just couldn't find stuff like that? Or do you feel like the UAW itself didn't focus on the kind of internal plant stuff? I'm interested in your reaction to that observation, at least, that the perception that I had.
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. One, the UAW since the 1940s didn't really engage in a great deal of grassroots bottom-up organizing. That, there'd be a new auto plant built, they'd have neutrality and card check, they'd have an election, they'd win, so General Motors or Ford built a plant elsewhere. At various points, they did some things with parts suppliers, but again, the UAW did more of an over-the-top approach where they would go to Ford and say, look, we want you to lean on the parts suppliers to do card check and neutrality. And so their grassroots organizing muscles were really atrophied.
Mm.
And in practice, they did, again, top down as a structure. They would send in organizers, and the organizers would be the ones who would be calling most of the shots.
Mm.
And this is something that various people at Daimler, at Mercedes, MBUSI in Alabama talked about, that the difference between the campaign this year and previous campaigns, that the UAW had like a one size fits all pattern, and it would be unrolled in the workplace. So I think that was one of the weaknesses in the campaign. So a couple of areas where I think you can see some um, things where there was some innovation and in this period was the idea of founding locals even
Mm.
after the losses, and this happened at Volkswagen and at Mercedes, that they founded locals, and those locals continued to exist even after the losses. And so that gave a place for people who were supportive of the union to focus and to act and to react when things happened in the company. They were already, a couple steps ahead as far as being able to have a coordinated response. So I think that has a lot to do with it. That this emphasis on the membership wasn't there until now. And I think one of the
Mm.
things that's changed with the UAW, with Brian Shepard becoming the new organizing director, is he's doing more of a bottom-up approach, like what he did when he was with the Service Employees International Union, in really communicating, you are the union, you have
Mm.
to organize this. And it won't succeed without you. And a lot of the people, particularly at the Mercedes plant, really noticed the difference and said
Right.
that made a huge difference in the election this year compared to in the past, where in the past they never had enough cards signed to even go forward with an election.
Right.
But that change to a more grassroots approach made a huge difference. And of course, any of you have been involved in these, the first time you try this, you make mistakes and you
Mm.
learn and you figure out how to do it better the next time. And I think there was a lot of learning that happened in Vance on how to move forward with another round of this. The second thing that I would say this is sort of a segueing into, well, why were things more successful this time at Volkswagen? Obviously they won the election, and in Mercedes, in Vance, Alabama, that they managed to get 43% of the vote. One of the things, when you look at Volkswagen in particular, that I think made a huge difference, I'd say two things to point to. One, the the foundation of the people who were pro-union remained strong and stayed in place and
Mm.
persisted. And they developed a good leadership. Steve Cochran has been very good as president of the local. And so I think that residual that remained gave something to build on. So when you try again, you're not starting from scratch. So I think that was important in Volkswagen. The other thing that was important in Volkswagen is actually changes that happened in Germany. I mentioned
Mm.
that the Works Council union relationship can sometimes be a frenemies relationship. And this was the case in the earlier organizing drives, that the old head of the Works Council in Germany really was skeptical about the UAW and didn't really want to devote a lot of time and effort or support. But he actually moved on and got himself a management job. But his successor, she's been fantastic. And Daniela Cavallo. And when the UAW went to the Works Council, she basically said, yeah, we're going to come out, we're going to tell management, not only do we support the union, but we're going to say to management, no captive audience speeches, no union busting law firm, or you're going to have trouble with us. And when the Works Council in Germany stepped up really went to bat for the UAW, that tore several pages out of the union avoidance playbook, and that helped a lot as well.
Right. And so, it seems like you think that a lot of the reason the recent campaigns have been at least more successful is because there has been more of a focus on actually what's going on in the shop maybe than there had been before. And in your book, it seemed like you believe that there was a that outside intervention also played a really large role in at least some of the campaigns, and in particular, you point to Volkswagen in, I think, 2014, when Volkswagen had a neutrality agreement with the UAW, and they were actually, if you read the book, it's kind of astounding how cooperative they were with the UAW and how much access they allowed the UAW inside the plant. But the outside entities were. There was a very similar campaign to what happened at Mercedes this year. There were op-eds, there were speeches, there was the governor, really attacking the idea of unionization. And you felt like where it was deployed, the outside intervention was very, very meaningful. And we've had Michael Goldfield on the program before, and I don't know, you respect his work and he respects yours, but he disagrees with the idea that outside intervention is very meaningful. And like as at least one example, he'll point to a unionization campaign. I forget what the industry was, but it was in Mississippi, where the governor, the senator came and threatened, to like explicitly threatening to take away incentives and to close the plant if they unionize, and they still unionized. It was like 80-20 or 70-30. It's overwhelming, but it was in like the 50s or 60s, I think, this example that he points to. And so he's just kind of skeptical of the idea that that the outside intervention is very meaningful. And even like, in my own conversations with the folks at Mercedes, they had a similar opinion. They didn't feel like the outside campaign, as huge as it was very meaningful. They felt like, if anything, it turned people towards the union. Like they were not happy about the idea of these politicians telling them how they should vote in a union election. So, I'm interested in how you kind of think about that, about the outside intervention and the idea that, like, how does that affect union elections in your view?
I think it can matter. I think, and it has mattered. I think the Volkswagen 2014 representation election really stands out as an instance where it mattered. And it can matter in subtle ways as well as explicit ways. And the subtle way is that as the state governments have been giving more and more and more subsidies to build a plant, upwards to $500 million of state tax monies going to build these plants, that it gives the politicians leverage to shape how the foreign managers react. It really constrains how they react. And I think this is, I think there's a difference between the 40s and 50s, the period that Michael Goldfield covers in the, 90s and beyond, in the period that I cover in that regard, because of just the massive volume of subsidies that you can see it making a difference in several places. Like you have Volkswagen management refusing to do card check, and there are letters that I managed to get a hold of between the two senators of Tennessee and the CEO of Volkswagen, where they said, remember, when we said we were going to give you all these subsidies, you said you weren't going to let the UAW in this plant. And so we want to make sure that you hold to this bargain. So there are a few smoking guns about this that I think stand out as the intervention having some effect. I think in the early days, when the governor of, like, I think in the 2019 election, the governor of Tennessee holding a captive audience meeting in the plant, that had an impact. And when you spoke to people, Volkswagen workers, they said, yeah, that sort of really changed the tone of things. That there are times when it can have an effect. I think what's happened, I agree with you that at Mercedes this year, that the outside efforts had a minimal impact. I think because the surprise of this in the novelty of it has worn off in some ways. And so it can vary and one can overstate it. But I do think there are specific cases, and I think particularly in Volkswagen, where you see the evidence of it. And there's one other thing that I'd mention in an indirect way. There's something that happens in almost every single one of these organizing drives, and that is an organizing drive will start, and all of a sudden there's an anti-UAW group of workers, and they have a website. They've got all sorts of resources that, and when you ask them, where does this come from? That they say, oh, it's employee donations. But when you track it down a bit farther, there's a lot more that's going on. There's local chamber of commerce, state chamber of commerce, business associations, and other sort of nefarious characters that fund these campaigns and roll them out. And even it goes beyond the local, because these campaigns, I'm sure many of your listeners have seen them, they look very, very similar. Like there's a pattern. And so it's this one, I don't have a smoking gun. It's one that I continue to look for of union busting firms is where is the place to look to find hard evidence. But I think there's a lot. I think that's one of the plays is sort of under the table funding these anti-worker in-plant drives. That they're always able to find some of the employees in the plant that are willing to engage in anti-union activity. Is when a drive happens.
Professor, I just realized we're at an hour already. I am sorry. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I do have two more questions if you have the time.
Sure,
is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Apologies. I've been enjoying the conversation. Appreciate you being generous with your time. I want to backtrack a little bit and go back to the pre-Fain days and one of the tactics that the UAW employed when they were trying to organize some of the southern facilities. And that was the new UAW. I mean, we've been hearing about a new UAW now and under Shawn Fain, but they use that language again, additionally, like 10, 20 years ago. I think under Bob King. And the new UAW, they meant it in that way, almost in literally the exact opposite of the way that it's being used now. That is, the new UAW is more cooperative with management. It is less adversarial. We want to be partners in production. We want to be team members with management. That's the new UAW. So how do you think that strategy played at the time in the South? I think I think there's a lot of credit going to the UAW right now for being kind of the exact opposite of that, and crediting that to their victories. But would a UAW that was more militant have had the same success that we're seeing today 15, 10, 20 years ago? I mean, do you think that at that time the new UAW, in the way that they meant it, was that the best they could have done, or should they have been doing something more like we're seeing now?
So it's a very good question, and it gets into a larger question about militancy as a tactic. And I think militancy is an extremely important tactic, and many breakthroughs, the bulk of the breakthroughs the labor movement has made in the century and a half since it's really been around have been through militancy. But that said, you have to be very careful that one can think of the PATCO, the air traffic controllers, that they took a militant stance but were vulnerable because they could be fired as government employees. And so you've got to have that foundation to be able to deal with whatever the counterattack is going to be. And I think the moment we're in, given the labor market, given sort of the greater insulation that the North American auto industry has from overseas competition compared to the 1970s and 80s, that I think with the tight labor market, and that I think that this was an opportunity to engage in militancy. I have a great deal of respect for Bob King. And I think Bob King was really trying something that made sense to try when he tried it. And that was to try to convince particularly the German companies to do what they do in Germany and to recognize the union. And he was trying to do an exchange. What he was trying to say is, we will give you what the Germans call social partnership. And that's why even in 2014, he talked about creating, and they actually made an agreement to create a works council at Volkswagen that would be done through a collective bargaining agreement rather than law. And so, and Bob King, before he was president of the UAW, and even while he was president, he was on the board for the GM subsidiary in Germany, Opel. GM sold them off after the financial crisis. And so, but the thing to recognize is when Bob King became president in 2010, that was right after the financial crisis, right after a big wave of layoffs that had happened in the auto industry. So he did not have the tight labor market that we have now. And so I think he had a weaker hand to play, and he tried to play it as best he could. But and I think if he had been militant in that period with still union members being laid off, I'm not sure it would have worked. I think it would have, so I think the lesson is you always need militancy, but militancy 100% of the time it isn't a good strategy either. You really got to know how to read your circumstance and seize the moment when the moment's there. And that's what Sean Fain has done. But don't be like Wile E. Coyote and run out off the cliff and then find out there's no ground there and then fall. So, which is what Patco did.
Right. Yeah, there was we had on a fellow a few months ago who was in the UAW, wrote a book about some of his experiences organizing as a a militant left winger socialist in the 70s and 80s, and there was actually a a story that he recounts in his book about how he voted to, as a member of the negotiating committee, to accept concessions, for the company, because exactly kind of like you just laid out, he didn't feel like the company was not bluffing. If they didn't accept these concessions, there really would be consequences. People really would lose their jobs, and this was the only thing that they could do in the moment. And he talks about how you have to kind of walk that line, and so I think that there are good lessons to be learned there. And so finally, we've been talking about the Fain administration through the throughout the conversation, but explicitly, let's focus on, I'm interested in your thoughts on it as a, as an entity and as a moment that we are in. Is the Fain administration, you believe, genuinely the beginning of a rise that we'll see from the UAW that's going to be kind of as consequential as the original organization of the auto industry?
I would say that the opening at Volkswagen is an opportunity that goes beyond that one plant. And it really is getting, the foot in the door that should allow the UAW, if it plays its cards right, to pick up 3 more plants. Volkswagen just bought Rivian, the electric truck company. And Volkswagen is building a Scout plant. So Scout is an old nameplate. It's a defunct nameplate. And basically, Volkswagen wants to build a competitive vehicle to Range Rovers and things like that, and use this Scout nameplate, which is a U.S. nameplate. And they're building a plant in South Carolina. They're also building a battery plant in South Carolina. So these contract negotiations with Volkswagen in Chattanooga are going to be very important on a number of fronts. One of them is getting a neutrality and card check for any other Volkswagen-owned plants in North America, and at least in the US and Canada. And it's something that means that if the UAW plays its cards right, it should be able to get 4 plants out of the success in Chattanooga. I also think a lesson from Volkswagen is, that would apply to Mercedes, is how to work the Works Council. I think a second election that would happen at the Mercedes plant, it will be crucial to get the Mercedes Works Council to intervene in the way that the Volkswagen Works Council did, with saying no union busting law firms, no captive audience speeches, and really bring that across. And I think that would make a difference. And it's hard to do things internationally. And I think just the timing was off with the Mercedes Works Council, that they sort of realized what was going on too late in the process. But and so they ultimately supported the UAW, but the union busting, campaign had already begun and everything, and the replacement of the manager had happened. So I think that the UAW has a good shot at getting those German plants and any additional German plants, like the Sprinter plant, which makes the Sprinter trucks in the Carolinas. getting that. So, playing the cards right, Volkswagen can get 6 plants out of this. The challenge is the Japanese plants. The Japanese plants are harder to organize. A year ago, I spent a semester teaching in Japan, and I also went and talked to the folks at Japan Auto Workers, and they just don't have the same sort of institutional setup in Japan to be able to influence Japanese management. So I think the Japanese plants will be harder, and Korean plants as well. And a lot of what will determine whether all the plants can be organized is how it plays out at those Japanese plants. Can the UAW, working with the people on the ground, develop a credible union promotion playbook that they can then deploy elsewhere to help facilitate the unionization of those plants? So I really think it'll swing on that. So, that Alabama Hyundai plant is crucial in this whole process, but it's a working process. And there's, unionization has always been experimentation and successful unionization. So I think the experimentation, innovation is going to be important. And I hate to leave you with this, but it is too soon to tell at this moment where things are going to go.
Right. Professor Stephen J. Silvia, the author of the UAW's Southern Gamble, Organizing Workers at Foreign-Owned Vehicle Plants, a professor at American University. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been great.
Thank you. All right, folks. Wow, that was longer than I thought it would be.
It was really good.
I really enjoyed that, though. That was awesome. I really do. I mean, genuinely recommend folks read the book if you're interested in this sort of thing. There's so much that we did not get to. Could have spent, easily another hour. Lots of good stuff, and like he mentioned, letters that he reprints in the book from politicians to management, between the UAW staff, it's a lot of really cool stuff in the book. The book is the UAW Southern Gamble, Organizing Workers at Foreign-Owned Vehicle Plants. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.